We acknowledge, celebrate, and pay our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First People on whose traditional lands we meet and work. Their cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We also acknowledge and celebrate that many of the speakers in this series were based on other traditional lands and territories across Australia and the world. We recognise their past and present leaders and acknowledge their contribution to our collective past and futures. Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in the cybernetics conversation. We're currently exploring the past, present, and future of cybernetics. Let's get started.
Welcome to Cybernetics Snacks, a speaker series featuring leading voices in cybernetics. And in the next 30 minutes, we'll ask our speaker, Chris, 4 questions, and they are the same 4 questions that we've been asking all of our speakers across the past few years. So following the session, you'll be able to find a recording of the session, plus a snack pack of all the resources that Chris has mentioned related to the talk to take home and think on and chew on a little bit further, and that will be on the School of Cybernetics website. In the speaker series so far, we've had a lot of great people contributing to our conversation on cybernetics, and today is no exception. I'm really thrilled that for our local Cybernetics Snacks presenter this session that we've got Professor Chris Danta, and we've unintentionally made this a little bit of an ANU alumni mini-series as well. Chris is also an alumni of ANU. He did his BA here and received honours in English at the University of Melbourne and completed his PhD in comparative literature at Monash University. And he has been an ARC postdoc fellow and is currently an ARC future fellow. His research operates at the intersection of literary theory, philosophy, science, and theology. He calls himself a literary anthropologist and is interested in how literary writers rethink what it means to be human by drawing on other knowledge systems such as religion and science. Chris is currently working on an ARC Future Fellowship with the title Future Fables, Literature, Evolution, and Artificial Intelligence. And Chris is going to do today's snack session as a presentation rather than a Q&A session like we had last time. So I will hand the virtual mic to him. But yes, welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much, Jess. And yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to speak. And it's an honor to speak in the series. And, let me begin as well by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to acknowledge this land as sacred as an unceded, living and full of story. As Jess was mentioning, before coming to the School of Cybernetics, before coming to the ANU, I worked for 20 years in an English department at UNSW. So my remarks today are sort of, from the perspective of being a literary studies scholar. It's interesting what I've found since coming to the school is that cybernetics unifies some of the different work I've done in my career. So I've worked in areas of, continental philosophy is one area, literary animal studies, looking at how animals are represented in literature, eco-criticism, thinking about the environment, and now sort of in this current project, more technology studies. And I've always had the habit, I think, in my career of looking outside my discipline. And for the answers for the questions I pose. And people have always called my work interdisciplinary, and I think sometimes that's a kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Sort of sometimes it's sort of code for people saying they don't quite understand what you're doing. And I think what's been great about coming to the School of Cybernetics is cybernetics is really accepting of that kind of interdisciplinary work. Work between disciplines and transdisciplinary work, and cybernetics is all about having conversations between disciplines. So that's something I've really enjoyed about coming to the school. I sort of feel like it's it sort of unites all this work that I've done in my career. It's really interesting to reflect. It's something that actually happens when you move. You actually start to think about what are the sort of unifying factors in your work, and it's been really interesting for me to do that. I've got, as Jess said, I'm going to do this as a sort of slide presentation. I've only got 5 slides, so I should be able to get it through quite quickly, especially given one just has my name on it. Okay, so why cybernetics? And I've got 3 three sort of answers here. And what happens with these answers, I'll just make the view smaller so I can see. These answers become increasingly subjective as we go down the list. My first one, because cybernetics treats the human, the non-human animal, the machine, and the environment as interrelated elements of a complex system. I think that's a fairly, uncontroversial sort of answer. But my next one, because it is interested in blurring the boundaries between the human, the non-human animal, the machine, and the environment. I think this is more sort of me saying what I would like to do with cybernetics and what I see cybernetics as being able to do. And the third one, because it is interested in decreasing the agency of the human and increasing the agency of the non-human. So something I want to do today is just make a little argument, especially for these second two answers to this question, why I'm interested in cybernetics. As Jess mentioned, I'm currently working on a project that examines how we perceive machines to be living and evolving organisms, and how literary writers tell stories about vital machines. So some of the writers I'm looking at, Philip K. Dick, Samuel Butler, George Eliot, Stanislaw Lem, Bo-Young Kim, many of them science fiction writers, to rethink what it means to be human by telling stories about vital machines. So cybernetics is so crucial to this project because it asserts that the boundaries between humans and machines, the animate and the inanimate, are becoming blurred in the present age. What's interesting is my project actually goes back to the time of Darwin. I mean, you could take this kind of question of vital machines, back to the beginning of history. But I'm particularly interested in how, when Darwin sort of proposed his theory of evolution, writers started to say, well, what happens if machines evolve? What happens if we see them as living organisms? And this is really when this present fear we have of machines taking over sort of begins. So what's fascinating about that is, given that the cybernetics sort of begins in the 1940s, is I'm kind of doing a history of cybernetics in the project. There's sort of interesting connections between this kind of evolutionary theory in the 19th century and the start of cybernetics in the 1940s. So I'm sort of tracing the roots of cybernetics. Just go on to the next slide. So, this is really my answer to question 2, which is, what is your favorite tool, approach, theory, text, person, story from cybernetics, and why? And I think what I have to say is I'm really stuck at the very beginning of cybernetics. I mean, I sort of see this as almost the inaugural gesture of cybernetics, is to say, well, the boundaries between the human, the living, and the machine are sort of becoming blurred. So this is a quote from Norbert Wiener. I could have provided many, many other quotes from different writers. And he says, in his 1948 book, Cybernetics, the many automata of the present age are coupled to the outside world, both the reception of impressions and for the performance of actions. They contain sense organs, effectors, and the equivalent of a nervous system to integrate the transfer of information from one to the other. They lend themselves very well to description in physiological terms. So what I'd say is, in terms of my engagement with cybernetics, I'm really stuck at that very founding moment where, Wiener will say, why don't we think of machines as operating in terms, like physiological organisms? So blurring that boundary between the animate and the inanimate. And something you want to say from the perspective of literary studies or from sort of art or literature is that there's so much playful engagement you can have with that. So writers will take that kind of idea that there's a sort of blurring of the boundary between humans and machines, the animate and inanimate, and tell sort of wild stories about it. Engage very playfully with it. So something I feel like literary studies can contribute to an understanding of cybernetics is this kind of playful engagement with this kind of founding gesture of the confusion between the animate and the inanimate, the living and the non-living. So this idea that machines imitate life, I think, is just so rich and has so many fascinating implications in different fields. And I think we really need to sort of stop and think about those implications and not just, sort of move quickly on past this point. So I really like Andrew Pickering's idea, for example, of cybernetics as ontological theatre. That cybernetics as a performative dimension sees identity as performed in the world. So Pickering says in his book, The Cybernetic Brain, cybernetics stages for us a non-modern ontology in which people and things are not so different after all. So he's just restating, what you see in this quote, this kind of the difference between people and things is disappearing. And I particularly like this idea of sort of a non-modern ontology. How does cybernetics invoke this way of being which is sort of almost a little bit at odds with our way of thinking about the modern world, the sort of instrumental way we tend to think about the modern world. So Pickering is sort of talking about how cybernetics challenges certain fundamental assumptions we make about the modern world by showing how non-modern modes of thinking, like the idea that things are alive, persist in this world. I started to call myself an animist, sort of this idea that, I think everything is alive. And there's another quote I have. I actually have this quote at the end of the paper, but Gray Walter, who developed the mechanical tortoises, Elmer and Elsie, these kind of little robot tortoises that steer around a room and have light sensors, very much in the way that Veen is talking about in this quote. He writes in his essay, An Imitation of Life, "Yet, as our imitation of life becomes more faithful, our veneration of its marvelous processes will not necessarily become less sincere." Quite like this quote, because I think what he's saying is that by building models of the world, so Gray Walter's building models of tortoises, of kind of very simple organisms, we actually come to understand the world. We're actually focused outward, trying to understand the world, and that's sort of not trying to capture the world, but just trying to understand what's so unknowable about the world in that kind of playful way. So a radical idea I'm testing in my work at the moment is this: what if we only come to know the human by staging cybernetical experiments or cybernetical dramas that involve human, non-human, and environmental agents? What if the meaning of the human and the non-human are worked out only in the changing relationships that these things have to each other in the world? So what I like about cybernetics is how it's a kind of exterior experiment, isn't it? So, ideas are played out in a very physical way, in a sort of cyber-physical, social, technical system. And we think about what it means to be human in that kind of social experiment. And I think what's powerful about that is it then has this effect of challenging potential assumptions that we have about the world, and the way that we want to sort of appeal to something internal, like a soul, spirit, sentience, whatever. And cybernetics sort of pushes us outside into this unknown, playful world. So we tend to assume that we know what the human is. From years of teaching animal studies at UNSW, people would always say, "Oh, that's very anthropocentric," and sort of as if they know what the human is. And I would sort of say, "What is the human? How do we get to know the human? Maybe we need to experiment in this way to actually understand the human." And we forget, I think, that the human is something that we're always renegotiating in the world. So this idea that cybernetics is the renegotiation of the human in the world. So as soon as we say that machines resemble living organisms, so this is remember my starting point. How can we go from there? We anthropomorphize machines by saying that we project something of the human onto machines. And detaching the human in this way from the human subject and attaching it to, say, non-human animals or to things, to machines, can have some interesting effects. So something I try to argue in my work is that anthropomorphism is not simply a sort of negative thing that we assume the identity of other beings, but it's a way that we actually open up a connection between ourselves and these other beings. So I've recently become fascinated by how artists and literary storytellers stage scenarios in which the human, the non-human animal, and the machine and the environment are shown playfully exchanging characteristics and positions with each other in the scenario. So how can we think of the human, the non-human animal, and the machine as substitutable identities, as taking the place of each other? And I want to give an example of this. Like most of my discussion is really related to this picture that I've kind of become fascinated with, very famous picture. So I call this idea of humans and animals and machines sort of substituting for each other, substituting identities for each other, the comedy of interspecies sociality. So I want to explain that, but I want to explain it by through a discussion of this example, this very famous painting. And this comes from work that I'm doing with Genevieve Bell on the phonograph. So this sort of started with me thinking about the phonograph, and sort of developed into this idea of the comedy of interspecies sociality. It's basically the idea of what happens if we think of humans, animals, and machines sort of interacting socially with each other in sort of comic ways, taking the place of each other and so on. But I'll explain as we go. So, in terms of a bit of background about the picture, this is Francis Barraud's 1898 painting, His Master's Voice. Barraud first painted the work in 1898 with Nipper the dog listening to an Edison Bell phonograph. So I've got that. This is actually the original painting. Quite fascinating. So that's a phonograph there, and what you'll notice is he's replaced it with a gramophone. So what happened was he eventually sold it in 1899 to the gramophone company, and at the suggestion of a friend, he painted over the phonograph with a gramophone. So the gramophone company were much happier to buy the painting for £100 it was with their shinier sort of disc gramophone in the picture. And what's interesting as well is he painted Nipper from a photograph. So Nipper was actually 3 years dead here. So it's a very staged scene. He'd inherited Nipper from his brother, who died in 1887, but Nipper died in 1895. So I don't know if you know this image, but it's become one of the most famous and iconic images of the 20th and 21st centuries, after becoming the trademark of the Victor Talking Machine Company, later Victor RCA. So you'll see it on record labels. His master's voice, HMV became a record label. It's interesting as well that a representative of the Edison Bell Company in London refused to buy the painting when he was trying to sell it, saying that dogs don't listen to phonographs. So I find that funny. This is precisely the point of the picture. And what's interesting about the story is that Francis Broad did observe his dog Nipper. It looks like a fox terrier, but maybe a bit of a Bitzer, becoming puzzled at listening to the phonograph. So what happened was, he saw his dog being puzzled, and then he decided that would make a good composition for a picture. So eventually he painted it. And another aspect that I find really interesting about the backstory is that Broad loved playing practical jokes on Nipper. So he would make cardboard cutouts of a cat around the house, and Nipper would run around and chase and get really excited about the cats. So what I find interesting about the painting, I sort of read it as a kind of staging of a practical joke, where he's sort of seen Nipper getting confused by this voice he's hearing on the phonograph, originally the gramophone in the picture. So the comedy of the situation is that the human, the non-human animal, and the machine are shown exchanging positions and characteristics with each other in the painting. So this is how I read it. The dog takes the position of the human master by listening to the phonograph. The talking machine takes the position of the speaking human, the master's voice. The master becomes a disembodied voice in the scene. And I also read the painting as having an observer. The human observer of the scene, the painter, Broad, takes the position of the non-human animal. It's almost like an observer watching this kind of scene. So if you imagine it, normally a human being, like this is how I imagine a human being would be listening to the phonograph, and what's happening is Nipper's taking that position. So there's almost sort of an active aesthetic subject listening to music or the voice in this kind of situation. So the painting represents to me, so this is this answer to this question, how do you sort of, what are you doing with cybernetics? I sort of read this as a cybernetic circuit involving the human, non-human animal, and the machine. And I read it as a cybernetic circuit of interspecies sociality. There's a kind of social scene where the dog is becoming puzzled at the machine. The human observer is kind of having a chuckle in the background, observing this kind of social scene. One way of thinking about it, I was just talking about this yesterday with someone. One way of thinking about it is as sort of establishing a social scene. If you actually put your hand up, like if I can't do it here on the screen, if you put your hand up and block out Nipper, you'll see that suddenly the phonograph looks totally different. It's not interacting with anything. So, the painting does an amazing job of establishing an interaction between two things. And that has this effect of making them more active. So scholars of technology have tended to analyze and theorize the phonograph by focusing somewhat reductively on its unique and revolutionary technical capacities, the sense in which it could record the human voice for the first time in history. And I think, this is what we're doing now with AI, focusing too much on its technical capacities for reproducing the human and not thinking enough about how it acts independently of this mimicry of the human as a social agent. So in his master's voice, the phonograph separates the human voice from the human body. The painting, and this is why it works so well as a piece of advertising, presents the fidelity of the recorded sound as being so high that Nipper thinks his absent master is present. So this is what a lot of people say about the phonograph. It makes sort of the absent source of the sound present through the fidelity of the sound. And the phonograph is seen to overcome the physical absence of the master in the situation by making him present as recorded sound. So I think that's the point of the ad, isn't it? This sound is so accurate that the dog is confused, thinks it's a human voice. But I think that misses something about the painting. So focusing solely on the phonograph's technical capacities to overcome the physical absence of the master causes us to miss the significance of the added social dimension of the scene in which Barod invisibly observes his pet dog Nipper being fooled by the machine. So the sense in which this comic's a comedy of substitution is taking place that I'm talking about. So the phonograph plays two roles in the painting. One is the standard interpretation as a recording device for capturing and replaying human speech. It momentarily confuses Nipper by projecting his master's voice to him with such fidelity that he thinks the human is physically present. But more mysteriously, it also acts as the catalyst for a comic form of interspecies sociality, in which the human observer momentarily feels superior to the non-human animal because the dog's charming expression of puzzlement at the machine's operation. So what I'm just trying to argue is that we need to keep thinking about this cybernetical, what I'm calling a cybernetical circuit between the human observer, the non-human animal listening, and the machine, the talking machine, as the gramophone was called, or the phonograph was called, interacting. So while acting as a proxy for the human, so that the idea of the painting is that the phonograph replaces the human, the phonograph also has a social agency of its own in the situation, right? So what I'm asking you to think about is, how do we think of this machine as a kind of agent in the situation, as having agency in relation to the other characters in the situation? While detaching the human voice from the human body, the phonograph also reattaches this recorded sound, to a machine body. Okay, so what it does is kind of creates a hybrid. The gramophone is a kind of hybrid identity, sort of partly human, in terms of speaking or recording sound, and partly mechanical. So this talking machinic body functions as a social agent in the scenario. So this is what I mean by, how do we think of machines as kind of having a sense of social agency? So if we just think of it as making the human master present, we're kind of reading it too anthropocentrically, I think, and not taking it on its own terms as a kind of social agent in the situation. So this is just an interpretation I have of the picture. A final point I think I would make about the painting is that the human is backgrounded in it. And this takes me to my last slide. So there's a sense in which the human is backgrounded. So Barod observes Nipper in the background. So the human is background in the sense of, the observer is not presented in the painting. And the human voice is disembodied. So as I've said, his master's voice is kind of a disembodied voice. So that's another backgrounding. And backgrounding the human in this way has the effect of increasing the agency of the non-human animal and the machine. So what I'm suggesting is, because we don't see the human directly, it's kind of displaced onto the machine, or it's in the background of the observer. What that causes us to think is that this gives the non-human animal Nipper more agency, and also gives the machine more agency. So something here, now I'm talking about a kind of technique that I think a lot of the literary writers that I'm looking at use. They sort of say, well, what happens if we slightly displace the human, slightly decenter the human, slightly background the human in the situation? What that allows us to do is to present the non-human animal as having more agency. It also enables us to present the machine as having more agency. So this is what I mean by backgrounding the human. It's a kind of technique that we can use. So backgrounding the human in a scenario can have the effect of increasing the agency of the non-human animal, machine, or environment in that scenario. So that's just, the little analysis I have of Barod's painting. And so this would be an example. My answer to the question, what am I doing with cybernetics? Like, this would be, for me, a cybernetical way of reading that painting that gets beyond that, the anthropocentric perspective, which just says, the absent master is somehow made present by the fidelity of the recorded voice. So just quickly to finish, the last question is, what's one thing you would remove or do differently in creating a new cybernetics for the 21st century? I think my answer to this would be for us to use cybernetics to think more about the social role of machines in our lives, to think about machines more, to think more about how, rather than just being tools, machines have an independent sense of social agency in our lives. To think of Siri, engaged, socially with programs like Siri. And I think the other point, I haven't really had a chance to talk about this, but I think the other point I would make is that cybernetics can help us to think about the agency of the environment. So this principle I've got up on the slide there of backgrounding the human can have the effect of giving the environment more agency. So I think getting back to my initial sort of desiderata, because it is interested in blurring the boundaries between the human, the non-human animal, the machine, and the environment, because it is interested in decreasing the agency of the human and increasing the agency of the non-human. So how can we use cybernetics to think about the non-human animal, the machine, and the environment having more agency than present? And Catherine Hales says something very nice about this in an essay. She says the fusion of cybernetics with environmental concerns offers potent new possibilities for research analysis and, perhaps most importantly, interventions. So this kind of focus on the environment as a sort of as something we need to do in the 21st century. But that's it. Yeah, so that's all I had to present. And thanks very much for coming and for listening.
Thank you, Chris. I guess everybody, we could give a virtual or physical round of applause for Chris. That was such a great presentation of your work and weaving in cybernetic principles into that as well. I felt like I learned a lot about you and your work and new things about cybernetics as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jess.
Want more? Check out the snack pack in the video description for bonus content and resources.